with respect to public conference number 44 and our efforts to launch our new distribution system planning work group. I'm Jason Stanek. I'm joined with three of my colleagues at the present today. This is a particularly significant issue, although it's one that has not been directly addressed in our suite of grid modernization efforts to date. However, now is the appropriate time for us to be addressing these issues as it ties into the many other PC44 efforts that have been underway for the past few years. It's clear that additional distributed energy resources are coming onto the grid faster and faster in terms of renewables, microgrids, demand response, energy efficiencies, electric vehicles, and many others. We're happy to have the Exelon Utilities here today to provide us with a baseline, and this background couldn't come soon enough. The state, as you well know, has very aggressive clean energy standards with a 50% RPS by 2030. And one need not look beyond their television set to see the impacts of climate change that are occurring throughout the world and our country. Just yesterday, we had some pretty substantial damage from tornadoes in Annapolis. Yesterday, for the first time in the history of New York City, they called a flash flood warning with substantial damage in the Northeast. Lake Tahoe is on fire, and my former home city of New Orleans is practically in the dark right now with 8 major transmission lines out of service. What's not being discussed is the fact that the distribution system also has a very substantial damage and destruction down in Louisiana right now as well. Obviously, as state commissioners, we don't control the wholesale market and interstate transmission, but we do have the purview and responsibility for ensuring not only the reliability, but more importantly today, the resilience of the distribution grid. So I'm happy to learn more today. I'd also like to highlight the good work that my colleague, Commissioner O'Donnell, spent the better part of 2 years on with the NARUC and NASIO task force on this very issue. So Commissioner O'Donnell is our resident expert here. We will rely on him and staff member Amanda Best, who supported him in this effort as we go forward. So today is the first step in a long journey, hopefully not too long, as we begin to figure out ways to accommodate a cleaner grid, additional energy resources, and improving the resilience and reliability of Maryland's distribution system. Let me now yield to and recognize my colleague, Commissioner O'Donnell, for some remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say from the outset, I think you're although appreciated, you're laying out me as being a resident expert. I may be overstated. I wanted to get that out up front. I wanted to welcome everybody this morning to our public conference 44 educational kind of level setting on distribution system planning and how it came to be that we're here this morning. Most of you know this, but some of you may not, and I'll say it. I went back and looked because I don't trust my memory as much as I used to, Mr. Chairman, but on September 26, 2016, the Commission issued its original order in Public Conference 44. And at the time, and after quite a bit of discussion, the Commission at that time laid out 6 areas of focus for our grid modernization process under Public Conference 44. Those 6 areas began to work through the process. That was our initial notification order on the creation. And a lot of water has passed over the dam, and we've made a lot of progress, and we still have a lot of progress to make. At the time, the Commission discussed eventually a 7th area of focus, and that was distribution system planning. But we weren't sure we had the resources, neither the resources nor the bandwidth to do that at that time, although we knew it was important to the grid modernization process. So we created it. We put it kind of on a step docket, if you will, that particular area of focus, and now we're moving forward with it, largely as a result of the recognition that as we moved into the new world in Maryland of multi-year rate plans and changed our form of rate making, and the continued proliferation of helping to meet our state goals through distributed energy resources, that this would become even more important. Also, that the task force alluded to by the chairman, the NARUC-NASIO task force, which included, of course, NARUC members from 16 states, NASIO members from 16 states, the Department of Energy, and many other stakeholders from all walks, including consumer advocates, cooperatives, large utilities, small utilities, municipal utilities, any manner of electric distribution planning stakeholders were involved in that process. It was a 2-year process, but it was never meant, and I need to state this, Mr. Chairman, it was never meant to be prescriptive. It was meant to be a guide tool, and each state could use as they saw fit what was applicable to them in their distribution system planning processes that they thought was appropriate. And that's what PC44 in this focus, this area will focus on. And it's good to level set in an educational setting here with this session so that we can begin that process. My view of the world as I learn, and hopefully I'll learn a lot from you as we go forward this morning and beyond, is that we know we will need increased transparency. We know we need to break down the many decades old barriers to scaling the walls of asymmetry of information regarding distribution system planning. But we also know that the utilities hold ultimate responsibility to plan their systems and to provide reliable and economic service to the consumers of our state. So having said all that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to this process. I'm excited about what it offers in terms of hope. And my hope is that eventually someday when we get there, starting in 2016, now 2021, and we'll go beyond to some very fruitful outputs in this process.
Thank you, Commissioner. I would like to associate myself with those remarks. Before we turn it over to Exelon for a presentation, I would just like to note, and this is an important piece of information, that the RFP, the request for proposals for the distribution system planning workgroup leadership, will be issued by PHI in the next few days. So that will be very important for setting the structure of the workgroup going forward. So please keep an eye out for that. PHI will be releasing that within the next week or so. With that, I would like to welcome the Exelon Utilities. I know we have a large number of staff members from the utility to launch a presentation. So I will turn it over to the Exelon Utilities. And we have your presentation on the screen now. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
All right, good morning. So the first thing I wanted to do is to go over some of the expectations for today's presentation. So today we're going to talk about kind of the core elements of the distribution system and their functions. We'll talk about system performance and how utilities provide reliable service. And then my counterpart, Eric, will talk about grid modernization and some new technologies and how the industry is evolving.
And Mr. Sacchi, if you'd like to just introduce yourself and the team that will be presenting today, that would be helpful up front. Thank you.
Yep, will do. Actually, that's going to be my very next slide. But I did want to highlight before we got into introductions that we do have a second session on the 24th, I believe, that will be dedicated to system planning and how the utilities plan and forecast the grid for future customer needs and how planning is evolving. And with that, I will go into introductions. So my name again is Ranjit Saki. I'm a manager for regional capacity planning focused on Delmarva Power and Light under the PHI umbrella of Exelon. My counterpart, Eric Henlon, is also a manager of regional capacity planning. He's focused on Baltimore Gas and Electric, and he'll join me today in walking through the presentation. We also have Rob Stewart, who's a manager of Smart Grid and Technology for PEPCO, and Alex Pregel, manager of capacity planning for BG&E on the call, and also many others supporting us today and assisting us with answering any questions. On this slide, we're looking at the Exelon Utilities in Maryland. We have Baltimore Gas and Electric, the nation's oldest utility, Delmarva Power and Light, and PEPCO. When combined, our companies serve the majority of Maryland customers. And to the right of the screen, you can kind of see a visual of the representation of the service territories in the state. In this slide, we kind of just show an overview of the power grid that enables electricity to be delivered to and from customers. As the commissioner said at the very beginning, above the line, we have the transmission grid, which is shown, which is usually above 69,000 volts, where bulk power is generated and transmitted and delivered to the distribution system. But below the line is the distribution system, which is what we'll be focused on today, because it's what we're working on and what's regulated at the state level. The distribution system is typically made up of medium voltage or primary components, so from 4,000 volts up to 69,000 volts in some areas, and low voltage or secondary components that are typically under 600 volts. So we'll talk about distribution substations, the primary system, and the secondary system in the next few slides. Something else I wanted to highlight here that we can see on this diagram that we'll talk about some more is the presence of generation at various points in the grid, from large generation on the transmission grid to behind the meter generation at the customer premise. So the first kind of component or portion of the distribution grid we'll talk about are substations, and they are where the grid transitions between high voltage transmission to medium voltage distribution. Power transformers, which you can see one in the picture here, are the devices that step that voltage up or down at that transition point. Substations also have breakers and switchgear, which are mechanical switches that isolate sections of the substations and work with protection relays to detect faults and protect the substation equipment from the effects of faults. The various components and substations are usually connected by what we call buses, and they're just rigid connections between the different components in a substation. Next, we'll talk about the primary distribution system or medium voltage system. Distribution lines, we also call them feeders or circuits. So I may use those terms interchangeably as this presentation goes on. They exit substations and transport energy between customers and the substations. These are made up of poles, conductors, insulators, manholes, cables, conduits, and various other devices. A majority of distribution systems are considered radial, which means customers have a single delivery feeder. Often they have a second one in the area as a backup, but in this what we call radial layout, customers are served with one feeder at a time. And there is a minority of what we call network systems. These are typically found in older downtown areas, business districts. And network systems, customers are connected to multiple feeders at the same time. But again, that's a minority of the distribution grid. And then at kind of the end of the primary system, if you will, we have service transformers or distribution transformers. These step down the medium voltage of the feeder to low voltage for consumption of the customers. And this is that transition point between the primary and the secondary system. These transformers can be pad mounted. The example of that is the green box in the larger picture here. or they can be even submersible for underground distribution systems. Or they can be pole mounted, as you see in the other two pictures. And then we have secondary lines or low voltage lines to transport the energy from the transformers to the customer premises. Then we have what we call services or service drops, and they're the final lengths of conductor in the grid that connect the customer premise. Again, these can be overhead or underground, and meters are the point at which the utility interfaces with the customer. Now, these devices are used to record customers' energy usage and production into the grid. Since the industry moved to smart meters, these devices also provide additional functionality. The additional usage data helps utilities do things like loading analyses and forecasting, as well as enables rate designs to benefit customers, like time of use billing, net energy metering for customers for generation, special rates for charging of electric vehicles, and so on. Smart meters also send signals to let the utility know when there are abnormal conditions, like outages or tampering with the meters. So that's kind of the conclusion of the discussion of the major pieces of the distribution grid, from the transmission system to the meters at the customer interface. And next, I'll talk about how the system performs in order to provide customers with stable and reliable service. So not only is it important to maintain capacity for our customers, but it's also essential to manage the voltage change between the substation and the customer service point at all times. For example, in Maryland, we have COMAR rules that say voltage at the utility service terminal should be within 5% for 120 volt service. So the utility has to make sure that the service voltage is maintained within that range. Providing customers with proper voltage and power quality is essential for them to be able to use their equipment appropriately. It's also essential to operate the grid efficiently, minimizing power losses. So here are some tools that we use for voltage and efficiency. We have load tap changing transformers and voltage regulators. These are special transformers that automatically raise or lower downstream voltage to maintain it within an appropriate range. We also have capacitor banks that are placed at various points in the grid. They also support voltage and the correct efficiency, or what we call power factor, by reducing the power losses caused by inductive loads. Not only is it essential to maintain power quality, but utilities are also tasked with maintaining reliable service to customers. The distribution system is critical infrastructure in our society, as we've seen in the different events that the chairman mentioned today. Damage to it from unexpected events requires a rapid response to ensure public, customer, and worker safety. Changes in climate are increasing the frequency and severity of extreme weather events. We also have other factors like inattentive driving, for example. They contribute to the hazards faced by the distribution system. In the pictures to the right, we show some of the major causes of customer outages: vegetation, weather, storms, equipment failure, the public, wildlife, and others. Utilities make investments like proactive replacement of aged equipment, vegetation management, building in redundancy in the grid, wildlife protection, and other programs to prevent outages and unsafe conditions, as well as to minimize their impact when they do happen. So some common metrics used to measure the performance of the distribution system of each utility are SAIFI, which stands for the System Average Interruption Frequency Index, and that's a measure of how often an average customer experiences outages. CAIDI, that's a Customer Average Interruption Duration Index. That's a measure of how long the restoration of service during outages takes. And SAIDI, which is kind of a combination of the two, it's the System Average Interruption Duration Index. It's a measure of how long an average customer experiences, how long of outages an average customer experiences. So what happens when outage events occur? The distribution system has devices that sense faults and open when they do so, de-energizing downstream lines to protect equipment and the public. These are what we call protective devices. Examples of these are relays and breakers that are in the substations. We have circuit reclosures at various points in the feeder main stems, and we have fuses on branches. These devices are placed strategically to minimize the impact of events to as few customers as practical. Once these protected devices operate, de-energizing lines, smart meters and advanced metering infrastructure, as well as customer calls, identify which customers are out of power, and predictions are made as to where the unsafe issues exist. Fault indicators are another device that aids responders in identifying the location of these electrical faults. Circuit reclosers and other switching devices, which are devices that make or break the flow of electricity, are used to further isolate the areas with damage and reconfigure the feeders to restore customers. Once as many customers as possible are restored, then the dispatch crews then focus on safely making repairs in order to restore the remainder of the customers and make the areas safe. So how does the utility manage all these components, respond to events, and keep the grid running smoothly? We have sophisticated operational control centers, and they receive millions of pieces of live data from the substations and the line devices to make sure the distribution system is operating properly. And these control centers are working 24/7, 365. When adjustments are needed, outage events occur, the operators in these control centers send remote commands to either make adjustments or to reconfigure the system as needed. They also dispatch field crews when the repairs are needed. On a daily basis, these control centers manage the configuration of the system. They coordinate maintenance activities and infrastructure improvement projects to maintain worker safety, as well as they make sure the system is as ready as possible for significant weather events by coordinating equipment inspections. So now I've given you a little taste of the major pieces of the distribution grid, their functions. I'm going to hand over to Eric, who's going to talk to you about grid modernization and new technologies and how the industry is evolving.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ranjit. So Ranjit gave us an overview of the system and the components that helps us to better operate the system, and just gives the utility an overall perspective of all the complexity that is involved in just managing overall the system in a manner where we can be reliable and efficient. But things are changing over time. Things are changing, and our customers' behaviors are changing. That is driving the way the distribution system is evolving. Some of the new technologies that customers are adopting are impacting how we operate the system and how we design the system. Some of these include distributed energy resources that are like PV, photovoltaic, solar arrays, wind, battery. Customers are deploying new technologies within their premises, within their homes, within their businesses for energy efficiency reasons and to participate in demand response. From an aggregate perspective, what we're seeing is the behaviors of customers, not only as a single entity, but now aggregating together to participate in generating in community solar, in virtual power plants. And with FERC order 2222, we're seeing that customers are now using DER to participate in the wholesale market. In addition to that, the climate drivers that we are looking at, from just improving the path to clean, is driving us to have more infrastructure to enable electric vehicles. And in addition to that, the customers are looking to how they can now use their electric vehicle to grid. And with the driving as a social perspective, fleet electrification and new types of loads from data center perspective are also some of the factors that we see, new technologies that we see our customers are adopting. To be able to serve and continue developing the distribution system, to serve these new behaviors, to continue serving customers in a reliable and efficient manner, there are certain studies we have to perform from a utility perspective, very complex studies that takes into consideration safety of our community and our customers at large, our employees, and the protection of our equipment that is on the system. Taking this DER, the DERs on the system now, creates a disparity in the load where we look at gross load versus net load, and we have to plan the system in such a manner that we can serve the gross load, whether or not the DERs are available, though most of the time we're looking at net load. DERs also provide some impact in the voltage, as Ranjit shared earlier, that we, the utility, are responsible for maintaining certain voltage level to our customers. Now with the DERs on the system and just the technical aspects of how they operate, they create certain impacts on the voltage, creating voltage imbalance, high voltage, which we have to study and make sure that the system is adequately engineered to be operated so that we are maintaining those voltage tolerances on the system. The DER now also creates a load imbalance, an imbalance in the phases, and also creates a challenge in identifying where faults are on the system. It's important as a utility to be able to identify when faults are on the system so we can isolate those faults, locate and restore as many customers as possible, and hence keeping the performance of the system very high in serving our customers. All these studies, all these things, considerations are taken into consideration, are all including in our hosting capacity studies and how we have to upgrade the system to accommodate these new technologies that the customers are deploying. Next slide, please. So there are a few things as a utility we have done from a grid modernization investment so far, and some that are in progress. We've done a lot of work between DPL, BGE, and PEPCO in regards to increasing dynamic and controllable technologies in our substation from a system protection, automation, and control. This gives the control center and the folks within the control room more awareness and visibility of what's going on out in the field, and better able to manage the crews and the personnel that are out there helping to keep the system in a manner that it's being operated in a reliable way. Another technology that we've invested in is distribution automation and automated restoration systems. Distribution automation includes how we operate all the capacitors, regulators, LTCs together in an integrated manner to maintain the voltages that we require, and also how we operate those switches those reclosers on the system, that in the event there is a fault on the system, an event on the system, the devices can help to isolate that fault and also restore as many customers as possible, even before the crews get out there to start doing more investigation on what was the cause. How can we get more customers in service and do some work and get the system back into normal configuration? Advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, and smart meters has played a critical role in how we operate in the system, which has been a key investment from the utilities perspective. The metering data, the consumption data from our customers has helped us to be able to better understand where we have growth on the system, not just at an aggregate level, but it can help us pinpoint in a smaller area. These devices also have the capability of sending information when there's an outage on the system that informs the operations center, informs the utility of the customers being out, and hence help us to better respond to those outages and the customer's needs. Now, none of the system protection and automation, distribution automation, AMI and smart meters are possible without a communications network. The investments we have done in the communications network, whether it's wireless, wired, or fiber, has all been driven by the requirements of the technologies that the devices are being monitored and the data that needs to get back. A couple emerging technologies that are in process for both PEPCO, DPL, and BG are advanced distribution management system that supports the operations center to be able to have more granular visibility, be able to run simulations of what's happening on the system, and to also optimize how they operate the system. This is definitely a journey. In addition to that, an emerging technology is distributed energy resource management system, which when coupled with advanced distribution management system, coordinates how DERs and provides a more insight on how DERs impact in the system and better informs the operations center of what the impact may be on the system before they start doing switching. So both of those technologies are emerging, and we are growing and continue learning about them. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, grid modernization is a journey. It is a journey where we started years ago and we will continue building on it. But the distribution system is becoming more and more complex every single day. And these complexities are driven by the customers' behaviors and the technologies they are adopting, and just the new world of becoming more clean. One of the crucial aspects of that journey is the communications and telemetry. Our experience of modernizing the distribution system have taught us that having a very robust and flexible communications and telemetry system is important in how we operate the system, how we manage the system. And that now continues on how we integrate DER into the distribution system, and how much more DER we can integrate into the system is crucial around how the communications infrastructure that we put in place. We've learned a lot around automatic sectionalization and restoration, the importance of having speed within the communications infrastructure and be able to monitor the system, to have an understanding of what we need to do before there is an event. So being able to have measurements, sensing devices out there, and have measurement of what is the state of the system before we actually have an event, so the system can respond in an efficient and accurate way. Without the data coming back in a timely manner, that creates a challenge. So we've learned a lot from that. And we're learning that the DER plays a crucial role in our automatic restoration systems. All this data that comes back from an operational system provides operational system data that helps us to better engineer and plan the distribution system. It is very complex today, and it's getting even more complex every day as the system becomes bidirectional. It was never intended initially to be a bidirectional system, and we have to evolve over time. And hence, the grid modernization is a journey. Next slide, please. In closing, we have a next session on September 24th that is scheduled, where we will talk a little bit more in depth around the Exelon Utilities capacity planning, providing an overview, capacity planning functions and key processes, forecasting approaches and capabilities, considerations that we take into planning from high penetration of DER. Distribution planning requires deep technical knowledge of how the distribution system is engineered, designed, constructed, operated, and maintained. This requires collaboration with multiple teams, multiple stakeholders, internal and external. And it takes a lot of understanding of how we will be able to improve hosting capacity, to adopt more distributed energy resources, to help us on our journey or a clean energy path. Distribution planning, tools and considerations, multi-year system forecasts and multi-year plans are some of the things that we have to take into consideration from a distribution planning perspective. The assessment, analysis, and modeling and simulation, being able to create somewhat of a virtual twin, an electronic twin of what the system is, so we can run module simulations and better understand before there are events on the systems. Identifying projects that are required to improve the system, to expand the capacity of the system, and what those solutions will be, are some of the things that we will discuss in our next session. Next slide, please. That ends our session for today. We're open for any questions you may have. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Henlin. Thank you, Mr. Sacchi, as well, for your presentation. I agree with your analogy at the end that this is a relatively long journey that we're on, and it's getting more and more complicated with every step. We also recognize that the distribution system planning process is changing for the utilities perspective, as well as we try to become more open and transparent. Just earlier this week, I was on a panel regarding ESG, which is the concept of increasing more environmental consciousness amongst our utility members, societal, as well as governance. And I think the distribution system planning effort touches both on the E, the environment, climate change issues, as well as governance, because up until now, distribution planning has been effectively the private domain of the utilities, I would argue. They conduct the planning and they present the expenses and the proposals for approval at the PSC. So let me ask the Exelon Utilities. Well, let me first thank the Exelon Utilities for preparing that presentation and giving us an insight into your process. So my first question is, are you prepared to open up your process and make it more transparent? And what challenges does that bring to your planning efforts that you've been using for, I would argue, for decades? Somebody's speaking, you might be on
Yeah,
mute.
I'm sorry, Commissioner. Chairman Stanek, a call was coming in at the same time I was trying to get off of mute. Yeah, I think that we are open, and we've commented that we would be open to a more transparent distribution system planning process. So I think that I don't know where the limitations on that would be. I know we've talked before about the potential sensitivities about certain aspects of the system, but I do think that the overall process, we filed a paper back in 2016, which talked about how we plan to include DER and demand response and direct load control at that time into our distribution planning process. So I do think that we are open to being able to have those discussions.
Thank you. Obviously, there will be limitations as to sort of non-public information that you may not be able to share, critical information. But
Correct.
having an open process, as will occur after today's public hearing, you'll have everybody from interested members of the public, interested legislators, environmental advocates, and others. So I just wanted to make sure that the utilities are prepared to serve as honest brokers and to share as much information and limit the amount of conflict that we'll be seeing. So, Mr. Stewart, I hear that we have your commitment there.
Yes, sir.
Earlier this summer in July, CNBC issued a report of all 50 states in terms of climate to do business. Maryland was rated as the state that advanced the most within a 2-year period. And it specifically called out the reliability of the distribution grid as one of the key factors, noting that Maryland was among the best, and some other states, such as Maine, was towards the very far end. So we've made a lot of progress since the dark days of the derecho in the PEPCO service territory. And we have been a leader as a state in rolling out some of these advanced state-of-the-art technologies. And Mr. Stewart, perhaps back to you. In 2011 and 12, the Commission authorized the recovery for expenses related to AMI smart meters. 10 years later, we're still paying for those smart meters. And I would argue that we're not getting the full capabilities of some of the technologies that have been and are continuing to be paid for by Maryland ratepayers. That's obviously just one example of technology. How do we protect against or future-proof the fact that some of these technologies will be very, very expensive for ratepayers to bear? I might argue that I might pose the question, can we afford it? I might also pose the question, can we afford not to make these investments now, despite the costs? But perhaps you or your colleagues, if I could ask you that question, how do we make sure we don't have trapped costs or paying for technology that may, such as our AMI meters, may be coming out of date relatively soon?
So I think I'll take the first pitch at this, and then I'll let my colleagues weigh in on that. I think as far back as 2010, we've had this vision for the smart grid, and that vision was that the foundational element of smart devices such as AMI, but also other intelligence that's built into devices. And then from that, the communication systems requirements, and I think you've heard that discussion today. And these are kind of evolving in an upward trajectory. Integrated IT systems, I think you're seeing that. We heard discussions about ADMS and the distribution resource management systems as well. That leads to more advanced analytics capabilities, and I think you're starting to see that evolve in our hosting capacity requirements. And so, to the degree we're demonstrating these capabilities as we build them, I think that's what you're starting to see, that evolution. But this kind of ends in sort of the smart grid nirvana, which is the real-time optimization of the grid. And that's sort of the goals of the initial objectives. And I think, from an AMI perspective, we talked a little bit about, how we use that for the outage detection, but we also use it, when we do the reduction, voltage reductions. We now use the AMI to understand, exactly, how much we would need to do the conservation for the voltage reductions. We're using that in our application process for net energy metering, so that we can automatically calculate the customer's load consumption for the application process. We are also using it in the hosting capacity process. So you are seeing the evolution of the benefits of the AMI data coming. In some instances, it's still a little bit of a manumatic process in which we take the data and sort of manually move it around. And I think the future that we have mentioned that the Exelon Utilities are moving towards with the ADMS systems are more of an automated opportunity to make all these systems work together collaboratively. So I do think it's on a trajectory. I think that we selected the AMI system 10 years ago because we felt like it was a future-proof technology. I think we're still seeing value in the AMI network today, and we're seeing additional value in all the different devices that we're starting to evolve into the system. And then as we move to the grid modernization piece, that's where we start to integrate the big pieces like the DER. We heard that it gets complicated when you start to get these the interoperable or intermittent generation sources. They can contribute to fault contribution in different sites, given the time of day and the amount of output. So kind of keeping track of all that is the goal here. And I think it's not to be flip, it is getting more complicated as we try to get the systems to be more and more automated. But the goal of the Exelon Utilities is to make sure that we keep that trajectory, we keep the technology future-proofed to the degree that we can. We look at new technology evolution and how that can be incorporated into these plans. So I think that's the goal here.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I don't want my comments to appear that AMI has not brought tremendous benefits to the state, particularly CVR. Although I do think that there are additional capabilities that have yet to be fully tapped, and I recognize that as a first mover or earlier adopter of this technology, that there will be some challenges. I recognize that the State Tower North, New Jersey, has yet to roll out AMI, but they're looking at our experiences and from both our benefits and our mistakes. I would also note, looking at the large number of members of the public, we also have at least one state legislator attending this hearing this morning, that there was some hard-fought legislative battles back during the period of the derecho, which resulted in our reliability statute, our reliability regulations, and we have admittedly a very progressive state legislature in the General Assembly. To the extent that we, as a work group moving forward, could address some of these issues, that may forestall any potential legislative fights and allow us to move forward with a better, stronger, more resilient grid going forward. Let me pause at this time. Recognize Commissioner O'Donnell for some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say, I realize we're at a very early stage of kind of level setting. Just went through a distribution system 101, if you will, for level set. And we've got a long way to go. In the next session, we'll delve more into the planning processes themselves that are employed by the Exelon Utilities. But let me follow up first on the chairman's question with regard to a commitment from the utilities for transparency. And I think you gave the right answer on that, Mr. Stewart. Appreciated, because it's going to be essential. Transparency is going to be essential to move this process forward into the new world. However, not only is transparency important, that is to say, to me, transparency is we get to watch a little bit more clearly what you're doing. But beyond transparency, inclusiveness. That is to say, including stakeholders earlier on in your planning processes that would allow people to understand, by breaking down those long existing barriers to asymmetry of information, allow people to understand how to evaluate at an early stage your capital investments, your distribution system planning going forward, but to give input and be included in those processes, not just watch through transparency, but the inclusiveness component is essential, I think, going forward. You're going to have ultimate responsibility, I believe, but the willingness to allow inclusiveness of stakeholders to propose other alternatives because they're armed with the appropriate amount of information that heretofore have been exclusively under the purview of the utilities, but is shared in a way that they can propose non-wire alternatives or suggest other capacity changes early enough in the process, and your willingness to include them in your thought processes, kind of not ex post facto, but early on, so that they're real and they're really included. So not just transparent, but inclusion. And I hope that wasn't too long-winded a kind of a question, but I'd like to hear the utilities' comments on inclusiveness of stakeholders in the planning process.
Yeah, I think if I'm gonna, I'll comment first, and someone can come behind me. But yeah, I think that we're here because we want to see how we can make this process work and be more transparent. I think it's hard to agree upfront as to what that transparency will kind of look like. I think through this process and through what we hope will be the discussions will better define what the roles are, what the timelines are, what the input looks like, so that we can make sure that it overall fits in, is expedient, and we can make sure that everybody gets heard that needs to be heard. I think that's the goal, and I think we would like to see that certainly as an outcome of this working group. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to say anything else.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. This is Alex Pregel, Manager of Capacity Planning for BGE. I just want to follow up on Rob's comments and to echo that we are open to working with the stakeholders during the work group, the DSP work groups, to look at both transparency and inclusiveness and enhance the whole overall process. But we do want to say that it's important to actually clearly define the roles of each stakeholders early on, and we did define the specific time frames, and actually clear delineation of the stakeholders' role versus the jurisdiction of the community and the utility, and the utility that has the overall authority over the process. We as a utility, we bear the ultimate responsibility for providing the safe and reliable power to our customers, and we want to make sure that that we work together to develop the appropriate amount of that would satisfy all the stakeholders.
I appreciate that. I told yesterday a CEO on a one-on-one meeting, may have been the day before on Tuesday, excuse me, but that the utilities need to have the confidence as we move forward along these lines that as a matter of their exclusive franchise, that is their monopoly status as regulated utilities, they're going to have to maintain the burden of safe and reliable and economic service. And that includes responsibility for your planning system. This, in my mind, I'll just speak for myself, is not intended to lift that burden. But if we're truly going to modernize our grid, truly going to move into an area where inputs that heretofore did not exist, and transparencies that did not exist, and inclusiveness that did not exist, and rate making justifications that did not exist are now available in the regulatory regimen that exists in the state of Maryland. Things are changing. The Exelon Utilities have clearly said that they're going to continue to change, and we have to evolve. And I heard a pretty clear answer on transparency. I'm not so sure yet how this plays out with regard to inclusiveness. And I'll just say that that's something, Mr. Chairman, that I'm going to be watching very, very closely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Is there a response to Commissioner O'Donnell?
Yeah, this is Eric Henlon. I just wanted to mention a little on the inclusiveness. We're on an educational journey where all stakeholders need to understand the complexity of the system and the many considerations that go into the investments and the decisions. And that journey is crucial on how we end the end state. And I think we've started the journey. What we're doing here, I think over the next few months or so, is going to be very impactful on what the end result is in this forum to have those discussions.
Thank you. I was just going to say, let me add my thanks to the Exelon Utilities for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And before I turn to some of my other colleagues for questions, let me also thank all the participants who are on the line. We have dozens of folks representing county agencies, such as Montgomery County, state agencies we have here, environmental advocates, legislators, as well as EV advocates on the call today. All of those participants on the call will be able to ask the Exelon Utilities questions after the commissioners depart later this morning. At this time, let me recognize Commissioner Michael Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sorry for joining a little late. I had to get my car serviced this morning, but again, I really also want to thank the Exelon Utilities for the presentation this morning. I wanted to pick up on a point that the chairman made, and that is, while our state is demanding cleaner and continue to maintain reliable services, and affordability is still very important. We have to be very mindful of the energy burden on many of our citizens. So as we look at grid planning, I guess one of the concerns I have is, and I wanted to ask, is the cost of service business model really going to help us get to the most economic and optimal decisions and solutions? And so I wanted just your comment on, whether utilities are considering, performance incentive mechanisms, PBRs, and as we look forward to, trying to get to those optimal solutions. And if not, can we start considering that type of, I guess, of a business model to again assure that we are continuing to provide cleaner services and not letting down at all on reliability?
I'll come in there first. I think certainly in the PEPCO and in the BG&E multi-year rate plans, we've suggested some performance trackers mechanisms, and I think we were open to looking at that from a reliability perspective. So I think we're certainly open to that level of performance and tracking as long as it's reasonable and achievable. And it's okay if it's a bit of a stretch. And I think some of our proposals were a little bit of a stretch and a tracker for that purpose. But I do think that we're certainly open to different mechanisms, if you will.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that, and I hope it's a discussion we can continue to have, because again, cost of service. When we think about all the various non-wires alternatives, we may not get to those types of solution or consideration of those types of solutions without considering performance incentive mechanisms, and the other kind of things that fall under PBR. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And just as a follow-up, I mean, there's no absolutes, and I know that we do look at non-wires alternatives probably more frequently than we discuss, and many times they're not the low-cost alternative, but we're hoping with the evolution of technologies, energy storage solutions and other solutions could be more cost-effective, and we're certainly looking at that every day.
Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I also wanted to add my thanks to the company for the presentation this morning. I think it sets us up nicely for not only our next session, but the work to develop the work group from here. And my question ties along the lines of both the chairman and Commissioner O'Donnell, but I'm looking more at the next steps from here for the commission. As you know, the commission will be, through one of the companies, is issuing an RFP very shortly to select a leader for our work group to move forward with the discussions. And as we've been discussing this morning, the company, while it has the ultimate responsibility to maintain and build the distribution system, you're willing to listen to and to participate and work with the work group. So I guess as a person that sat in some work groups in the past, I'm a little bit concerned about the structure from here and what we hope to see happen at the end of this process. When our work group leader organizes and coordinates and produces whatever type of response the commission wants from the work group. Work groups, as we all know, are not the most fun places to be. I mean, the parties may disagree. There'll be a strong debates and discussion. And oftentimes there'll be situations where multiple parties who could be very experienced and knowledgeable on the issues simply disagree with each other. And so we could have a scenario where the utility companies are on one side and multiple other parties, many of whom could be participating with us this morning, including policymakers and various advocates, are on the other side. So for the company, I'm curious as to what type of conclusion do you think this work group should have? And by conclusion, I mean, what type of results are you looking for? If the commission issues an order, for example, that says utility companies, we agree with these members of the work group, this is how we should move forward with distribution planning. And that conclusion is not the one that the utility thinks is in the best interest of the system. How do we proceed from there?
Yeah, I'll try to weigh into that, and my apologies, because I think maybe some of these questions we should address at the next session when we talk more detail on the planning process itself. I think we are hiring the vendor for the process on behalf of the commission. And I think that at the end of the day, we're the ones that are going to be reliable for the safe and reliable operation of the electric grid. So I think everywhere in between that, I think we have the opportunity to discuss, how stakeholders can get engaged, how we can share as much of the planning process as reasonably and safely possible in all that. But I think early on we discussed the importance of every stakeholder understanding, kind of what the role is, what the guidelines are. I think that in and of itself, from my personal perspective, is one of the things that we would like to see establish, is what that structure would look like, so that we can have those discussions and make sure that we're capturing relative information and sharing relative information at the end of the day.
All right, thank you. So as I understand, then are you looking at this work group process more of an informational sharing process, more where you're making your decision-making process more transparent, and to the extent ideas come up that you haven't considered, you would consider them, but you're not looking for the commission or perhaps the work group to give direction as to what should happen from here in terms of distribution planning. Is that capturing?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I think we're evolving our distribution planning capabilities to meet the needs of the technologies, as we speak. And I think we certainly would be willing to address in a working group format opportunities to do that further, and what considerations might improve that process. So I don't want to make this sound like it's a one-way street, because that's not the intention here. I do think at the end of the day, we're going to be the ones held accountable for the performance of the distribution system. So we need to make sure that decisions get made that are appropriate. But our goal is to make sure that we establish a process here where we can reach a consensus on that. And so that's the kind of high level objective going in.
Okay, so, and I guess I'm going to yield for a moment to one of my colleagues if there's any interest in asking additional questions, but I'm curious as to, for your distribution planning process, at least up until this point, is this process something very new for you, or is this something that the company has had some experience in having interacted with before? So, and by experience, that could come from federal government, from regional, like a PJM or something, or do you have a practice in receiving input and considering that input from parties that are not part of the company for purposes of distribution planning?
I may actually defer to Alex on that as far as the existing planning process. I know we've participated in working groups before, and certainly, have supported and strived for openness and transparency and collaboration there. I feel like, and Alex maybe can shed some light on this, but our planning process is certainly nothing new, but we do adopt additional aspects of it as we see the technology. So the 8760 approach that has been discussed is a way in which we can take a closer look at the data of what's going on and make better decisions based on solar, for instance. And so, I'll kick it over to Alex, but I kind of feel like we're not doing this on slide rules. We're adapting technology as the technology is available and making sure that we're staying current with it. So Alex, I'll let you weigh in.
Yeah, and I think most of this information will be covered at the next session, where we will go in depth on the distribution planning process. We will cover the tools. But as Eric has mentioned, this is a journey. We do have an established planning processes that we follow, but as the world changes, we adapt and we change the processes as well. So the planning in the environment with the bidirectional power flows and the distributed energy resources, large capacity distributed energy resources, will have to be plan that will have to be done utilizing different tools than the tools that existed time ago. So we are planning, our processes are evolving, and our tools are evolving as well.
All right. Thank you very much for answering some of my questions. Well, actually, you've answered all of them. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Herman.
Thank you very much. A lot of my questions have been asked, but Mr. Stewart, I heard a couple of words. You know, I hear the companies talking about transparency and being open, but then I hear words like that the participation has to be reasonable and safe. I believe you used reasonably and safely associated with participation, and that used the term relative associated with information. So those are kind of qualifying words to me, and they raise some concerns. So can you address my concerns?
Certainly, and my reference there was in how we share what I would consider information that might be threatening to the safety and security of the overall distribution grid, and how that information gets shared. It wasn't meant from anything other than just the reference to safety and security of the actual distribution system itself. You know, there is some information there that we would need to make sure of. And, you know, even from a critical cybersecurity perspective, there would be limitations as to how we could share information and who we could share information with. So, you know, I think as we start to evolve this process, we can better define what those limitations might actually be. But I think, you know, sitting here today, there is a point in which we share non-public transmission or I'm sorry, non-public distribution system information.
Right. I mean, I understand that when we're talking about specifics of the distribution system and locational issues and that sort of thing. But I think what we're talking about here is really a discussion about how you plan the system, not about any specific spot on the system, but how it's actually planned and whether or not parties can have some input into the planning process, not necessarily participating in every single decision about distribution system, just understanding how it is that you plan and being able to comment on how that goes. So I hope, and you don't have to respond to this, but I hope that we don't use confidentiality as a way to keep parties out. I mean, obviously we want to protect information, but here we're talking about processes and concepts, not necessarily specifics. So I hope you keep that in mind when you continue your discussions. Thank you.
Certainly. Certainly.
Commissioner O'Donnell has a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on Commissioner Linton's line of questioning. Mr. Stewart, several times today I heard you say, as technologies evolve, and of course that's true. Nobody disagrees with that. But it's more than just technologies, in my opinion. It's as public policies evolve. Spent 20 some years in the legislature. We have legislators on the line. The world of policy in the energy sector is rapidly evolving. And our distribution system planning wasn't created or structured in a way that accommodated those very rapid and aggressive policy changes in light of climate change. But I hear you keep focusing on only technology, and I'm probably hearing that wrong, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about the state goals, electrification of transportation, renewable energy portfolio standards, greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, you could just go on and on and on, all the policy changes, and that pace of change is not going to stop anytime soon. So I didn't hear in your words, and I hate to focus on words because that's not really fair, but I want to understand the thinking of the companies in planning ahead in these processes that we're discussing here for public policy changes they're not going to slow down. Those changes are going to continue. We're going to continue to see aggressive, progressive pressures to change these systems to accommodate a different way of thinking. And so can I ask you to comment on that, not just technologies, but public policy?
Certainly, and I, I mean, I apologize if my comments had a technology slant, because we were geared up today to present on the technology of the distribution system and the evolution of that technology. I think we can dig deeper into responding to some of these questions in the next session. But I do think that embedded in that, I mean, we've got 28,000 net energy meter customers in the Maryland area, and we've got another 4,000 pending. We've known that growth now for some time. We are certainly aware and supportive of the state's goals for electrification, not only for public vehicle, but also for fleet and school systems. And we know we're working with Montgomery County on a project for bus electrification, and the size of the charging requirements are fairly large there, but there is also an opportunity to support the grid with that. And so, yes, we are realizing that the policies are driving change as well as the technologies. We just want to make sure that we see the technology evolution, we plan for the technology evolution, but that we can use that to achieve the policy goals as well.
So I appreciate that, and I assume that was the case, but I wanted to kind of hear that, and I think it's important to recognize that as we consider process changes in this area, that we consider the realization and adoption of planning processes that accommodate the achievement of state goals in a rapid, cost-effective, efficient manner. So I think that's important, an important component of all of this.
Absolutely agree, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good point, Commissioner O'Donnell. Obviously, our utilities span multiple states, but as far as this proceeding concerns, we are concerned about the policies of the state of Maryland. Commissioner Linton has a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It touches a little bit on one of your earlier questions and Commissioner O'Donnell's most recent line of questions. I'm tying back to the PowerPoint from pages 5 through 10. I think that's roughly the sections where basically you're talking about the general structure of the distribution system, how it operates from generation all the way down to the drop line and the meter. As we know, across most of the country, a lot of customers are looking forward to having their service reconnected now. And so because of it's been lost due to a catastrophic storm. And the utility companies there, through a lot of very great and important work, are working to reconnect everyone as quickly as possible. And in doing so, we talk a lot about building back better, trying to make the system stronger, to be more resilient. But that's not really the concept right now. Right now, the important point is to get the service on as quickly as possible, so at least the customers and they can continue receiving service and kind of get things back to normal, repair, recovery, things of that sort. So I'm curious as to how basically I'm wondering if are we moving in the right direction by constantly responding in that way? I mean, should we be thinking more about long-term, and maybe the distribution, maybe the planning work group will get into some of these discussions, I hope so, but curious as to your thoughts on whether or not the system that we have now, it wasn't built for things like net metering and solar and power flowing in two directions and things of that sort. But we seem to be just thinking about keeping it structurally built the same way. And this is a pretty broad question. And at first I wasn't going to ask it, but it seemed like it was a good chance to do it now. What are your thoughts on that? Should we be thinking a little more outside of the box? I mean, should we think about microgrids, about localized solar, or more localized generation as opposed to transmission over longer distances? What are your thoughts on something like that? And I know this is a 5,000 foot level question, but
Yeah, I think one of the things that would be interesting, and I don't know if this working group is the place to work out kind of the expectations for future resiliency projects. I think that's still been a little bit open as to what kind of latitude there would be for some resiliency projects. But I think for us, we like to look at designing the system so it will last, and it will hold up to things. But I mean, I think basic infrastructure, we still fall prey to tree off right-of-way trees falling on lines and taking wood poles down and breaking them, and it just takes time to bring the wood poles back up. But I think we can certainly be open to alternatives from a construction perspective, and I think we're looking at some of the state of the art of construction techniques on a daily basis. But I think it's coming to a common agreement and understanding as to kind of what the resiliency expectations are, and then what's the most cost-effective mechanisms to put in place. I would think that would be a side discussion. Like I said, I don't know if that's part of the DSP working group. It could be an interesting discussion that may spin a separate kind of team or some other aspect to look at that. But when we think about above ground, then we say, okay, well, maybe instead of wood poles we do steel poles, and then maybe we only do steel poles on certain circuits. And that kind of gets into some of the discussion we had in the multi-year plan about the 69 kV upgrades that we had planned. But I do think that we're trying to figure out the best way to utilize the most advanced technology and the best construction techniques to build the system. I think at the end of the day, we do recognize that while a very small percentage of customers can operate their solar systems absent of the utility, Ford is advertising with their new Lightning pickup in 2022. People are going to be able to backfeed their house. So what is that going to do? And what are those projections look like? And it's a way, and the Venn diagram starts to get really congested when we look at the evolution of all of these different capabilities on the consumer end, plus the expectations that we have, and then try to do that within a reasonable budget for that. I think this is probably part of the discussion that we'll have.
Thanks, and I appreciate that. It's my question was inspired obviously by the very recent events, but also because of Chick-fil-A of all places. And it's not because I'm hungry, but it's because we have one nearby home that has a fleet of vehicles that they use for serving their customers, for delivery of food their customers may purchase. There's 16 of them. And I've always wondered why those cars aren't electric vehicles. And then I started thinking about what that would mean for the local grid and the local system if that one restaurant decides to electrify his entire fleet. And so there's local challenges that will come from that, and impacts to the grid surrounding them. And I'm just curious. I was just curious about. I've been thinking a little bit about what happens from that and what are the background ramifications for the distribution system. And so that's thinking long term about making sure that the system is ready for those kinds of challenges, and is really what I'm hoping this work group will be able to reach and touch on. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That's all I had.
Yeah, just a kind of a follow up to that. I mean, I think that what you're seeing among the utilities in Maryland, especially the Exelon Utilities, you're seeing some of the best reliability ever. But we recognize that there still can be outages that are created by storms. But I hope what you're also seeing is the time for that restoration is going down as well. And so for us, it's we understand if the FAA doesn't upgrade to a more advanced air traffic control system, right? Because we spend more time waiting for flights or waiting on planes, but for us, we need to make sure that our systems are being upgraded, that we're utilizing these technologies, we're creating these automated systems so that we can accommodate these changes in the distribution system as they occur, and try to anticipate that. And then keep the intelligence that we have on the distribution system from fighting itself due to changing grid conditions. And so, as the grid gets more complex, I think our importance on the understanding of how all of these different devices interact are going to be more important. And just 10 years ago, I had a discussion with our distribution of system operations at the time, and she told me that we would never be able to do real-time three-phase power flows on the PEPCO grid because it was just too complicated. And yet here we are 10 years later. So, you know, the capability, the ability to do these advanced analytics are all evolving, and we want to make sure that we're using that to the advantage of the grid, which could drive to some degree some resiliency benefits as well.
Are there any additional questions from commissioners? Right. As Mr. Henlon stated, this is a journey, and we are taking the first step officially today with this background. The commissioners will look forward to reconvening on September 24th for the second educational session. As we prepare to go off the record, the commissioners will exit the room, and the other members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions of the Exelon group. In a moment, Molly Knoll will give instructions to the party. So please stay tuned. The commissioners will now depart. We are off the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For everybody who's staying in the room and for those who are watching on YouTube, you're welcome to join us in the WebEx. I'm going to put up a slide just for a couple minutes for the YouTube feed that includes the link if people want to join us. We'll start stakeholder questions at 11:35. I have received some questions in the chat. You can use the Q&A function, you can use the chat function, you can put them publicly, you can put them privately. We're very inclusive here. This portion of the meeting will be more like a work group meeting. So things are not for attribution. You can feel free to ask questions without being concerned that you'll be held to it at a hearing at a later date. If the BG&E folks want to take a quick look through the questions that are in the chat to be prepared, that would be great. And I do apologize if there are disruptions on my end. I am quarantining with my 2 children after a positive COVID in the family. So I'm going to go on mute real quick and we'll start again at 11:35.